Takeshi Yamamoto sat in his corner office in Tokyo, staring at the reports spread across his mahogany desk, and none of it made sense for. 15 years he had built his technology company from nothing more than a dream and a small apartment in something that spanned 3 continents, with offices in 12 countries. But right now, looking at the numbers from the Los Angeles branch, he felt like he was looking at a stranger. The revenue looked fine on paper, and the quarterly projections seemed acceptable, but there was something else hidden in the details that made his stomach turn employee. Turnover had jumped 40% in the last year. Alone, and the anonymous complaint forms that HR collected had tripled, and when he read through some of them late at night when everyone else had gone home, he saw words that made him angry. Words like disrespect and favoritism and fear. These were not the values he had spent 15 years building into his company, and they certainly were not the culture he had tried so hard to create, but his American executives kept telling him everything was under control. They sent him polished presentations and confident emails, assuring him that the complaints were just from a few troublemakers who could not handle high-performance standards, and that the turnover was normal for the industry. But Takeshi had not gotten where he was by accepting easy answers. He had started his company with a simple belief that if you treated people with dignity and respect, they would pour their hearts into their work, and that belief had never failed him before. So why was it failing now in Los Angeles? Takeshi stood up and walked to the window overlooking the Tokyo skyline and watched the lights flicker on as evening settled over the city. He thought about his father, who had worked as a factory supervisor and who had taught him that a leader who stays in his office never truly knows his people, and his father used to say that the view from the top floor is always beautiful, but it shows you nothing about what happens on the ground floor. That memory sparked an idea in Takeshi's mind, and at first he pushed it away because it seemed too extreme, too risky, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. What if he did not announce an inspection, or send auditors, or demand meetings? What if instead he simply went to see for himself, but not as the CEO, and not with the fanfare in preparation that always preceded his visits? If he went invisible the next morning, Takeshi called his most trusted HR director, Keiko Nakamura, into his office and closed the door. He laid out his plan and watched her eyes widen with surprise. He would go to Los Angeles, undercover as a maintenance worker for 2 weeks, and he would observe the office as it truly was when nobody was performing for the boss. Kako hesitated at first, pointing out the risks and the complications, but Takeshi had made up his mind. She agreed to help him arrange everything. In secret, 2 weeks later, Takeshi arrived at Los Angeles International Airport, carrying a single backpack and wearing clothes he had bought specifically to look ordinary. His hair had started graying at the temples, which actually helped him blend in, and he had let his stubble grow out during the flight. Nobody at the airport recognized him, and why would they? He looked like any other tired traveler in his 50s arriving for work. Keiko had arranged for him to stay in a modest apartment near the office and had coordinated with the janitorial supervisor, who believed they were helping train a new worker from the Tokyo office only. Keiko knew the truth. On Monday morning at 6 a.m., Takeshi put on the dark blue uniform that had been left for him with the name Ken stitched above the pocket. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. CEO was gone, and in his place stood Ken the janitor. The Los Angeles office occupied floors 3 through 7 of a modern glass building in the business district, and Takeshi arrived with the morning cleaning crew. The supervisor, Carlos, was a kind man in his 60s, who showed Takeshi where to store his things and how to operate the industrial cleaning equipment. Carlos spoke slowly and used simple words, assuming that Ken's English was limited, and Takeshi played along, nodding and smiling and saying very little. First day passed in a blur of mopping floors and emptying trash bins and wiping down desks. Takeshi pushed his cart through corridors he had never seen. Despite having visited this office 3 times as CEO, and he realized that those official visits had only shown him conference rooms and executive suites, he had never walked through the actual workspace where most of his employees spent their days. What he saw troubled him deeply. Employee break room was cramped and outdated, with flickering fluorescent lights and a refrigerator that hummed loudly and smelled faintly of spoiled food. Meanwhile, the executive lounge on the 7th floor had leather furniture, an espresso machine, and windows overlooking the city. The contrast was stark, and it bothered him, but the physical spaces were not what disturbed Takeshi. Most it was the way people treated each other. On his second day, while cleaning near the cubicles, he overheard a manager named Richard Crawford speaking to one of his team members. The employee had made a small error in a report, and Richard tore into him with words that dripped with contempt. He did not raise his voice, but his tone made it clear that he considered the employee. Beneath him, the worker apologized repeatedly, his face red with embarrassment, while his coworkers kept their eyes on their screens, pretending not to notice. Takeshi kept mopping, but his jaw was tightly at her. That afternoon, he was cleaning the 4th floor when he saw a young woman carrying a box of her belongings toward the elevator. She was crying quietly, trying to hide her tears, but Takeshi could see them. He later learned from Carlos that she had quit without notice after only 6 months with the company. That made 3 people who had quit that week alone. By the end of his 3rd day, Takeshi had filled 2 notebooks with observations he wrote late at night in his apartment, documenting everything he saw and heard. A pattern was becoming clear. The executives had created a culture of fear where people stayed late not because they loved their work, but because they were afraid of being seen as uncommitted. Managers took credit for their teams' ideas and blamed their teams for their own mistakes. There was no trust and no respect flowing downward through the organization. Meanwhile, everyone smiled and acted professional when they thought someone important might be watching. On Thursday morning, Takeshi was cleaning the 3rd floor offices when he noticed something that caught his attention. There was a young woman named Yuki Santos who worked in data analysis, and she was always the first one at her desk and the last one to leave her workspace. Was covered with charts and code printouts, and she seemed completely absorbed in her work, even when everyone around had access to employee files through Keiko. And he looked up Yuki's record that evening. What he found amazed him. She had developed 3 major improvements to their core software in the past year, and each one had been implemented company-wide. But her manager, Richard Crawford, had presented all 3 innovations as his own ideas. Yuki had never been promoted, and her salary had barely increased, despite her contributions. The injustice of it made Takeshi angry, but he also felt ashamed. This was happening in his company under his leadership, and he had not known. The next day, Friday of his 1st week, Takeshi made a point of working near Yuki's Ariyoshi. Stayed late again, and around 7 p.m., when the office was nearly empty, he saw her put her head down on her desk. First he thought she was just tired, but then he heard the quiet sound of crying. He hesitated because Ken, the janitor, would probably just move on and mind his business, but Takeshi, the human being, could not walk away. He approached slowly and cleared his throat softly. Yuki looked up, startled, and quickly wiped her eyes. Shoo. Started to apologize and gather her things, thinking she was in the way of his cleaning, but Takeshi shook his head in halting English with an accent. He asked if she was okay. Maybe it was because she felt invisible to everyone else in the office, or maybe it was because sometimes it is easier to talk to a stranger. But Yuki started speaking. She told Ken about how she loved the actual work, but hated feeling like her efforts meant nothing. She talked about how her ideas were stolen, and how she was passed over for promotions while less qualified people moved up because they were better at office politics. She said she was thinking about quitting, even though she had dreamed of working for this company since college. Takeshi listened to every word, and his heart broke a little more with each sentence. When she finished, he did not know what to say that would not give away his identity, so he simply said in his broken English that her work was important, and that someday the right people would see it. Tuki smiled sadly and thanked him for listening before. As she left, she asked his name, and he told her Kenshi, said her name was Yuki, and that she hoped she would see him around after. She left. Takeshi sat down at an empty desk and thought about everything he had learned. This was only week 1, and already he had seen enough to know that major changes were needed. But he also knew he needed to see more and understand the full scope of the problem before he acted. Over the weekend, Takeshi reviewed his notes and made plans for week 2. He also reached out to Keiko through encrypted messages and asked her to prepare legal and HR teams for what might be coming. He did not give details yet, but he wanted them ready when Monday of the second week arrived. Takeshi returned to the office as Ken and continued his observations. He paid special attention to Richard Crawford and the other senior managers, watching how they operated when they thought nobody important was looking. What he discovered was worse than he had imagined. There were patterns of discrimination, with certain employees getting opportunities while others were overlooked based on factors that had nothing to do with their abilities. There were instances of harassment that had been reported but swept under the rug. There were financial irregularities that Richard seemed to be hiding through creative accounting. But perhaps most disturbing was the culture of silence that had taken hold. People knew what was happening, but they had learned that speaking up only made things worse. So they stayed quiet and did their work and hoped to survive another data. Keshi realized that this was not just about a few bad managers. The entire system had become toxic, and fixing it would require more than just firing a few people. It would require rebuilding trust. From the ground upus, he pushed his cleaning cart through the office that Monday afternoon. Takeshi felt the weight of what he needed to do, but he also felt something else. He felt grateful that he had chosen to see the truth for himself rather than relying on reports and presentations. His father had been right all those years. The Gotha view from the top floor was beautiful, but it showed you nothing about what really mattered him. What really mattered was happening right here on the ground floor, where people like Yuki were pouring their hearts into their work despite being treated poorly, where people like Carlos, the janitorial supervisor, showed up every day with dignity and pride in doing their job well. These were his people, and he had let them down by being too far away to see their reality. But now he saw it clearly, and soon everyone else would see it. Tuesday morning started like any other day for Takeshi. In his role as Ken the janitor, he arrived at 6 a.m. with the rest of the cleaning crew and collected his supplies from the storage room on the second floor. Carlos, the supervisor, asked him how he was settling in, and Takeshi smiled and gave a thumbs up because Ken was supposed to have limited English. The truth was that Takeshi spoke English fluently after years of international business, but playing the role of someone who struggled with the language had given him an unexpected advantage. People talked freely around him, assuming he could not understand their conversations. That morning, while cleaning the fifth floor break room, he overheard two managers discussing their strategy for the upcoming performance reviews. They were planning to give low scores to several employees who had actually performed well, because those employees had questioned some of Richard Crawford's decisions in meetings. One manager laughed and said that people needed to learn that being right was not as important as being loyal. She scrubbed the counter harder than necessary, trying to contain his anger. This was exactly the kind of toxic thinking that destroyed good companies from the inside. After finishing the break room, he made his way down to the third floor, where Yuki Santos usually worked. He had been thinking about her over the weekend, about how much talent was being wasted because of poor leadership. When he reached her area, he noticed she was already at her desk. Even though it was barely 7:30, she was staring at her computer screen with intense concentration, typing rapidly and then stopping to review something before typing again. Takeshi began emptying the trash bins near her cubicle, working slowly so he could observe without being obvious on her screen. He could see what looked like code for some kind of data analysis program. Even from a distance, he could tell it was sophisticated work far beyond what her official job description required. As he moved to the next trash bin, Yuki suddenly let out a frustrated sigh and leaned back in her chair. She rubbed her eyes, and Takeshi noticed she looked exhausted. Without thinking, he paused and in his broken English asked if she was working too hard. Yuki looked up, surprised that the janitor had spoken to her. Then she recognized him from Friday night. When he had found her crying, her expression softened and she smiled a little. She said she was trying to finish a project before the deadline, but that it was more complicated than she expected. Techie nodded sympathetically and said something in simple English about how hard work was good, but rest was important. Tugi laughed softly and agreed. She asked if he wanted to see what she was working on, and Tugi was surprised by the offer. Most people in the office treated the cleaning staff as if they were invisible, but Yuki seemed genuinely interested in sharing her work, even with someone she assumed would not understand it. She turned her monitor toward him and began explaining in simple terms she was developing a program that would help the company predict customer needs based on their behavior patterns. The current system they used was outdated and inefficient, but her new approach could save the company millions of dollars while also improving customer satisfaction. As she talked, her whole face lit up with enthusiasm. This was clearly someone who loved what they did, and Takeshi felt a mix of admiration and sadness and admiration for her talent and dedication, and sadness that such a valuable employee was being overlooked and undervalued. He asked simple questions, playing the part of someone trying to understand. Despite a language barrier, Yuki patiently explained everything using hand gestures and drawings on her notepad. One point she pulled up a comparison showing how much faster her program worked compared to the old system, and even pretending limited understanding, Takeshi could see it was impressive then. Her phone buzzed and her expression changed. She looked at the message and her shoulders sagged. She apologized to Ken and said she had to go to a meeting as she gathered her things. Takeshi noticed her hands were shaking. Slightly after she left, he continued cleaning, but his mind was working. He made a mental note to have Keiko pull the details on Yuki's project submissions to see how many of her ideas had been implemented without recognition. That afternoon, Takeshi was assigned to clean the 7th floor executive area. This was where Richard Crawford and the other senior managers had their offices. The space was noticeably nicer than the rest of the building, with better furniture and artwork on the walls, and even the trash cans were higher quality. As Takeshi emptied bins and wiped down surfaces, he kept his ears open. Richard's office door was partially open, and Takeshi could hear him on a phone call. He was talking to someone about the quarterly numbers and how they needed to make sure the Tokyo office stayed happy. But the way Richard talked about it made it clear he saw Takeshi and the other executives in Japan as obstacles to manage rather than partners to work with. Richard said something about keeping the right image and making sure certain problems stayed buried until after the review. Pure Takeshi made note of every word later. While cleaning the conference room, he found documents that had been left on the table from an earlier meeting. Were printouts of an analysis about customer retention, and when Takeshi recognized the work immediately, it was Yuki's project, the one she had shown him that morning. But at the top of the presentation, the author was listed as Richard Crawford. Takeshi took a photo with his phone, making sure to angle it so the evidence was clear. This was not just taking credit for someone's work anymore. This was outright fraud, putting his own name on documents he had not created. The rest of the week continued in similar fashion. Takeshi observed and documented and gathered evidence of a workplace culture that had gone completely wrong. Saw talented people being overlooked while incompetent managers were promoted. He witnessed small cruelties that added up to create an environment of fear and resentment. He heard conversations that revealed just how disconnected the leadership was from the people doing the actual work, but he also saw moments of kindness and humanity that gave him hope. He saw coworkers helping each other when managers were not looking. He saw people staying late not because they were afraid, but because they genuinely wanted to help a teammate meet a deadline. He saw Carlos, the janitorial supervisor, treating his team with respect and dignity, and how that created loyalty and pride in their work. On Wednesday evening, Takeshi was cleaning near Yuki's desk. Again, when she suddenly appeared looking upset, she sat down heavily in her chair and put her head in her hands. Takeshi hesitated, then approached quietly. He asked in his simple English if everything was okay. Yuki looked up, and for a moment he thought she might send him away, but instead she just started talking. She said she had just come from a meeting where Richard had presented her analysis project to the senior team. He had presented it as his own work, and when Yuki tried to speak up and mention that she had done the research, Richard cut her off. He said she had helped with some of the data entry, but that the concept and analysis were his. Everyone in the room had believed him, or at least nobody had challenged him. Yuki said she felt stupid for thinking that speaking up would make a difference. She said this was not the first time it had happened, and she was starting to wonder if she should just accept that this was how things worked. Takeshi felt his anger rising, but he kept his expression neutral and sympathetic. He told her in his halting English that honest work was always valuable, even when others did not see it right away. Said that the truth had a way of coming out eventually. Yuki smiled sadly and thanked him for being kind. Said it meant a lot to have someone listen, even if that someone was the janitor who barely spoke English. Then she did something unexpected. She asked Ken if he would like to have coffee with her in the break room. She said she knew it was unusual, but that he was one of the few people in the building who had shown her any genuine kindness lately. Taishi agreed, and they went to the small break room on the third floor. Yuki made 2 cups of instant coffee, and they sat at the worn table near the window. She started asking him about himself, and Takeshi had to think quickly. He told her a version of the truth. He said he had worked in business in Japan for many years, but wanted to experience life in America here. Said he took the janitorial job because it was honest work and because he wanted to see how American companies operated from the inside. Yuki seemed to accept this and began opening up more. She talked about her background, how she had studied computer science and dreamed of working for a innovative tech company. She said when she got hired, she thought all her dreams were coming true. But slowly she realized that the company's values on paper were very different from how it actually operated. She talked about other talented people who had left frustrated and defeated. She mentioned a man named David Chen, who had been one of the best programmers in the company but quit after his ideas were stolen one too many times. She talked about how the few people who tried to report problems to HR found that their complaints somehow always made their way back to the managers they were complaining about. As Yuki talked, Takeshi listened carefully, making mental notes of names and situations to investigate further. He also found himself genuinely moved by her story. This was not just about business metrics anymore. These were real people whose careers and lives were being damaged by poor leadership. When their coffee break ended, Yuki thanked Ken again. She said talking to him helped, even though he probably did not understand everything she was saying. Takeshi just smiled and said he understood more than she might think over. The next few days, Takeshi made a point of being around when Yuki was working, not in a way that would seem strange, but just enough that they would cross paths. She started greeting him warmly each time, calling him Ken-san after he mentioned that. San was a polite way to address someone in Japanese, and she seemed to appreciate having someone in the building who treated her like a human being rather than just another employee. On Friday, Yuki did something that surprised Takeshi. She brought him a small bag of Japanese snacks she had bought from an Asian grocery store. She said she thought he might be homesick and that these might remind him of Japan. Akishi was touched by the gesture. Here was someone who was being treated poorly by her own management, yet she still had the kindness to think about a janitor she barely knew. He accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. Evening, after most people had left, Takeshi found Yuki still at her desk, working on something new. He approached, and she looked up with a tired smile. She said she was working on another project, but this time she was not going to submit it through official channels. She said she was going to document everything carefully and keep copies of all her work. She said maybe someday when she left the company, she would make sure people knew the truth about where these innovations really came from. Takeshi nodded approvingly. He wanted to tell her that someday would come much sooner than she thought he wanted to tell her that her work had already been recognized by someone who mattered, but he could not. Yet instead, he just encouraged her to keep copies of everything and to trust that honest work would eventually be rewarded. As he pushed his cleaning cart toward the elevator that night, Takeshi reflected on everything he had learned. Yuki represented everything good about his company. She was talented, dedicated, and innovative, but the current leadership was crushing that potential. How many other employees like her were out there suffering in silence? How much innovation was being lost because good people were leaving or giving up? The numbers and the reports had told him something was wrong, but meeting Yuki and hearing her story had shown him exactly what was at stake. This was not just about fixing policies or restructuring management. This was about restoring dignity and justice to people who deserved better, and Takeshi was more determined than ever to make that happen. The second week of Takeshi's undercover operation began with a light rain falling over Los Angeles. He arrived at the office building Monday morning at his usual time and found Carlos already preparing the cleaning equipment for the day. Carlos seemed troubled about something, and when Takeshi gave him a questioning look, the older man shook his head. Sadly, he mentioned that another employee had quit over the weekend day. A woman named Patricia Lin, who had worked in customer service for 3 years. Carlos said she was a good person who always treated the cleaning staff with respect, and now she was gone. Takeshi asked what happened, and Carlos said he did not know the details, but he had overheard that she had some kind of confrontation with management that made 7 people in 2 weeks. The turnover rate was even worse than the reports had indicated. As Takeshi made his rounds that morning, he noticed the atmosphere in the office felt heavier than usual. People were quieter, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of tension. He learned why when he overheard a conversation in the 4th-floor break room. 2 employees were talking in hushed voices about a new policy that Richard Crawford had announced. Apparently, anyone who wanted to work from home even one day a week now needed written approval from their direct manager, and Richard himself. The policy had been announced Friday afternoon via email with no discussion or input from the staff. One of the employees said it felt like they were being punished for something. Other agreed and mentioned that several people had been relying on flexible schedules for childcare and other family responsibilities. Taish continued wiping down the counters, but his mind was working. This kind of sudden policy change with no employee input was exactly the kind of leadership style that created resentment and distrust later. That morning, while cleaning the executive floor, Takeshi noticed Richard's door was open, and voices were coming from inside. He slowed his pace as he approached, pushing his cleaning cart quietly. Richard was meeting with 2 of his senior managers, and they were discussing the new work-from-home policy. One of the managers asked if they really needed to be so strict about it. Richard's response made Takeshi's blood run cold. He said that people had gotten too comfortable, and that comfort led to complacency. Said they needed to remind employees who was in charge, and that the best way to do that was to take away privileges. He laughed and said that if people did not like it, they were welcome to leave because there were always more candidates waiting. One of the managers pointed out that they had already lost several good people. Richard dismissed this, saying that nobody was irreplaceable and that they would just hire younger, cheaper workers who would be grateful for the opportunity. Techi gripped the handle of his mop tightly. This was not leadership, this was tyranny, and it was happening in his company under his name. He finished cleaning that section and moved on, but the conversation stayed with him that afternoon. Takeshi was assigned to clean the conference rooms on the 3rd floor. As he entered the large corner conference room, found it empty except for a laptop that someone had left behind. He recognized it immediately as Yuki's laptop because she had a distinctive sticker on the cover. He was about to leave and find her when he noticed the screen was still on. What he saw made him pause. There was an email open, and even though he knew he should not read someone else's correspondence, he could not help but see the subject line. It said, "Final warning." Takeshi hesitated, then looked more closely. The email was from Richard Crawford to Yukiette, stated that she had been insubordinate in a recent meeting by questioning his presentation. It said that if she continued to challenge management decisions, her employment would be terminated. It also mentioned that her recent performance reviews had been poor, which Takeshi knew was impossible. Given the quality of work he had seen her produce, this was retaliation, plain and simple. Richard was punishing Yuki for daring to speak up about him stealing her work. Takeshi took a photo of the email with his phone. This was evidence of workplace harassment, and he was building quite a collection. Just then he heard footsteps and quickly stepped away from the laptop. Yuki rushed in, looking worried. She spotted her laptop and her shoulders relaxed. She saw Ken and smiled apologetically, saying she had left it behind by accident. Takeshi nodded and continued his cleaning. He wanted to say something to comfort her or warn her, but he had to maintain his cover. As Yuki gathered her things, he noticed her hands were shaking. Shoot, looked stressed in it way that went beyond normal work pressure. After she left, Takeshi stood in the empty conference room and made a decision. He had been planning to continue observing for the rest of the week, but he had seen enough. The situation was worse than he had imagined, and people like Yuki were suffering while he gathered evidence. It was time to move to the next phase. Evening, after most employees had gone home, Takeshi sent an encrypted message to Keiko in Tokyo. He told her to prepare for his return and to arrange for a full management review of the Los Angeles office. He also asked her to compile complete employment records for several key employees, including Yuki Santos, David Chen, and Patricia Lin. Finally, he told her to have the legal team ready because there would likely be terminations and possibly legal action. Keiko responded quickly, asking if he was certain Akishi confirmed that he was absolutely certain. Tuesday morning, Takeshi arrived at work, knowing that this would be one of his last days. As Ken the janitor, he had already arranged with Keiko to have his reveal happen on Thursday. That gave him 2 more days to gather any final evidence and to prepare. As he was organizing his cleaning supplies, Carlos approached him with a concerned expression. He asked if Ken was feeling okay because he seemed different somehow. Takeshi assured him everything was fine. Carlos studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said that Ken reminded him of someone he used to know, someone who seemed quiet on the outside but was always watching and thinking. Takeshi smiled at that and said, "Sometimes quiet people see the most." Carlos laughed and agreed, then headed off to start his own rounds that afternoon. Takeshi was cleaning near the executive offices when he witnessed something that confirmed everything he had learned. There was a young man named Robert Park who worked as a junior analyst. He had been called into Richard's office, and the door was open enough that Takeshi could hear. Richard was berating Robert for a mistake in a report, but what struck Takeshi was not just the criticism, but the way it was delivered. Richard's tone was condescending and mocking. He questioned Robert's intelligence and competence. He suggested that maybe Robert was not cut out for this kind of work. He said these things loudly enough that other people in nearby offices could hear. Robert stood there, taking it his face red with humiliation when Richard finally dismissed him.
Ouch.
Robert walked out with his head down. Several coworkers glanced at him sympathetically, but nobody said anything. Nobody intervened or stood up for him. This was the culture that fear had created. People were too afraid for their own jobs to defend each other. After Robert left, Takeshi continued cleaning outside Richard's office. Through the open door he could see Richard leaning back in his chair, looking satisfied. He was on the phone with someone, laughing about how he had just put a junior employee in his place. Takeshi felt disgust wash over him. This man had no business leading anyone. Wednesday morning brought another revelation. Takeshi was emptying trash bins on the 4th floor when he found documents that had been thrown away. They were printouts of an internal survey about workplace satisfaction. The results were damning, with over 70% of employees reporting that they did not trust management. That described a toxic work environment and fear of retaliation. But what caught Takeshi's attention was a handwritten note attached to the papers. It was from someone in HR saying that Richard had instructed them to bury these results and not share them with the Tokyo office. This was a direct violation of company policy. All workplace surveys were supposed to be reported to headquarters. Richard was deliberately hiding evidence of the problems he had created. Takeshi carefully photographed the documents before throwing them back in the trash. That afternoon, he had another encounter with Yuki. She was in the break room making tea. When he came in to restock supplies, she greeted him warmly and asked how his day was going. Takeshi responded in his simple English that it was a good day. Yuki smiled and said she wished she could say the same. She looked exhausted, and Takeshi noticed dark circles under her eyes. He asked if she was okay, and she hesitated before answering. Then, in a quiet voice, she said she had been job searching. She said she had tried to make things work, but that she could not continue in an environment where her work was stolen and she was punished for speaking the truth. She said she loved the company's mission and values, but that the reality of working there was completely different. Takeshi felt a pang of sadness. Here was exactly the kind of employee any company would be lucky to have, and she was being driven away by poor leadership. He wanted to tell her to wait just a little longer. He wanted to tell her that things were about to change. Instead, Hugh just said that he hoped she would find a place that valued her. Yuki thanked him, said that talking to him had been one of the few bright spots in her recent weeks at the company. She said it was funny how the janitor showed more leadership and kindness than the actual manager, Sif. Only she knew how right she was. That evening, Takeshi was cleaning the executive conference room when he made his most significant discovery yet. Richard and 2 other senior managers were having a meeting, and they had left the door slightly open. Takeshi positioned himself in the hallway where he could hear but not be seen. What he heard was stunning. They were discussing the quarterly financial report that would be sent to Tokyo. Richard was instructing the others to adjust certain numbers to make performance look better than it actually was. He said they needed to hide the true cost of the turnover and make it look Like productivity was higher. One of the managers expressed concern about the ethics of this. Richard cut him off, saying that what Tokyo did not know would not hurt them, he said. They just needed to get through the next review cycle, and then they could figure out how to fix the real problems. But Takeshi knew there was no intention of fixing anything. This was fraud, pure and simple, and it was being done deliberately to deceive him and the other executives in Tokyo. He recorded the entire conversation on his phone. This was the final piece of evidence he needed. After the meeting ended and the executives left, Takeshi stood alone in the conference room. He looked out the window at the Los Angeles skyline and thought about everything he had witnessed. Stolen work, and the harassment, and the discrimination, and the fraud, the good people being driven away, and the culture of fear that had taken root. His father had been right about needing to see things from the ground floor, but his father had also taught him something else, that once you see injustice, you have a responsibility to act. Takeshi had been patient and thorough in gathering his evidence, but now it was time to act. Thursday would be the day of reckoning. Sent one final message to Keiko, confirming that everything was ready. She responded that the team in Tokyo was prepared and that they would arrive in Los Angeles Wednesday evening. The plan was set in motion. On Wednesday morning, Takeshi went through his routine as Ken one last time. He cleaned the floors and emptied the trash and restocked the supplies, but there was a different energy to his movements. Now this was not just a janitor doing his job. This was a CEO preparing to reclaim his company. He made sure to greet Yuki. When he saw her, she smiled and waved, and he felt glad, knowing that soon her talent would be properly recognized. He saw Robert Park, the young analyst who had been humiliated. Soon Robert would work in an environment where mistakes were teaching moments, not opportunities for public shaming. He saw Carlos and the other members of the cleaning staff. Soon their work would be valued as much as anyone else's in the company. That afternoon, Takeshi changed out of his janitor uniform for the last time. He thanked Carlos and told him he had learned more in 2 weeks than he could have imagined. Carlos smiled and said he had a feeling Ken was someone special. Takeshi left the building and went back to his apartment to prepare. Tomorrow he would return, not as Ken the janitor, but as Takeshi Yamamoto, the CEO, A&D. Nothing in the Los Angeles office would ever be the same again. Thursday morning arrived with clear blue skies over Los Angeles. Takeshi woke up early in his modest apartment and looked at himself in the mirror. For 2 weeks he had been Ken, the quiet janitor who observed everything and said little. Today he would reclaim his identity as the founder and CEO of the company he had built from nothing. He put on a crisp suit and tie that had been delivered the previous evening. His appearance was transformed. Gone was the tired janitor in the worn uniform. In his place stood a business leader who commanded respect, but Takeshi knew that true respect came not from clothing or titles, but from actions and integrity. He had learned that lesson well over the past 2 weeks. 8 a.m., a convoy of 3 black cars pulled up to his apartment building. Inside were Keiko
Nakamura,
his trusted HR director, and several other executives from the Tokyo headquarters. Also present were 2 lawyers and a senior investigator from their internal compliance team. Keiko greeted Takeshi with a respectful bow. She asked if he was ready, and he nodded. He was more than ready. He was determined. The convoy made its way through morning traffic to the office building. Takeshi had instructed them to arrive at 9:30, when most employees would already be at their desks. He wanted everyone to witness what was about to happen. Meanwhile, at the Los Angeles office, Richard Crawford was in his element. He had scheduled a morning meeting with his senior team to review the quarterly numbers before they were sent to Tokyo. The falsified numbers that Tokyo had heard them discussing. Richard was confident and relaxed. He had no idea that his world was about to collapse. At 9:15, Takeshi sent a message through the company's internal system. It was addressed to all Los Angeles employees, and it simply said that there would be an important announcement at 9:30 in the main lobby. Everyone was required to attend. Richard saw the message and frowned. He had not authorized any announcement. He called down to HR, demanding to know what was going on. The HR representative, who was not part of Keiko's inner circle, said she had no information. Richard was annoyed, but not concerned. He assumed it was some corporate initiative from Tokyo that he had not been briefed on. He Told his team they would attend the announcement and then get back to work at 9:25. The lobby began, filling with employees. People were confused and curious. Announcements like this were unusual. Yuki Santos stood near the back of the crowd. She had been working at her desk when the message came through. Now she stood with her arms crossed, wondering what this was about. Park, the young analyst, was there too, looking nervous. He always looked nervous these days after weeks of being undermined by Richard. Carlos, the janitorial supervisor, stood off to the side with some of his team. They had been told to attend as well. At 9:30 exactly, the front doors of the building opened. In walked Keiko Nakamura, followed by several people in business attire that no one in the Los Angeles office recognized him. Then Takeshi Yamamoto walked in. Several employees who had met him during his previous official visits recognized him. Immediately their eyes widened in surprise. The CEO was here. And this was clearly not a routine visit, but most employees, including Yuki, had never seen Takeshi in person. To them, he was just another executive from Tokyo. Richard Crawford stood near the front of the crowd with his senior managers when he saw Takeshi and the entourage. His expression shifted. He plastered on a smile and moved forward to greet them. This was earlier than expected, but Richard was always ready to perform for the Tokyo executives. He extended his hand toward Teki and began speaking. In an overly friendly tone, he said what a wonderful surprise it was to have them visit. He said he wished he had been notified so he could have prepared properly. Takeshi looked at Richard's extended hand, but did not shake it. The lobby fell silent. Smile faltered. Takeshi spoke in clear, authoritative English that carried through the space. He said there was no need for preparation, because he had already seen everything he needed to see. Richard looked confused. Kachi continued. He said that for the past 2 weeks he had been working in this office not as the CEO, but as a member of the janitorial staff. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Richard's face went pale. The Loys began looking around at each other, trying to process what they had just heard. Yuki felt her heart skip a beat. Could it be possible? Could Ken have been at that moment? Takeshi's eyes swept across the crowd and found Yuki. He gave her a small nod of recognition. Yuki's hand flew to her mouth as understanding Don Ken. The kind janitor who had listened to her cry about her stolen work was the CEO of the entire company. She felt dizzy with the realization. Takeshi turned his attention back to Richard. He said that during his time undercover he had witnessed systematic workplace harassment, discrimination, theft of intellectual property, and financial fraud. With each word, Richard's expression grew more stricken. Teki gestured to Keiko, who stepped forward with a tablet. She began displaying documents on a large screen that had been set up in the lobby. The first image was the email Richard had sent to Uki, threatening her employment for speaking up. Then came photos of the presentation where Richard had claimed Uki's work as his own. Next were the survey results that Richard had ordered buried. Then the recording of Richard and his managers discussing how to falsify the quarterly reports. Finally, there were statements from former employees, including Patricia Lin and David Chen, describing the toxic culture and why they had left. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Richard tried to speak, but Takeshi held up his hand. He said that Richard Crawford was terminated. Effective immediately, security would escort him from the building, and he would be hearing from the company's lawyers regarding the fraud to security officers. Appeared, moved toward Richard. Richard's face flushed red. He started to protest, saying this was all a misunderstanding. He said that Takeshi did not understand how things worked in America. He said that his methods got results. Teki cut him off. He said that stealing from employees and creating a culture of fear were not methods, they were failures of leaderships, and they would not be tolerated in his companies. Security led Richard toward the exit. He passed by Yuki for a moment. Their eyes met. Richard's expression was full of anger and resentment. Tucky stood tall, meeting his gaze without flinching. For the first time in months, she felt no fear. After Richard was gone, Takeshi addressed the crowd again. He said that Richard's 3 senior managers who had participated in the fraud were also terminated. The men were escorted out one by one. The lobby was completely silent except for the sound of footsteps. Employees watched in stunned disbelief as the leadership structure they had known collapsed in a matter of minutes. Once the terminated managers were gone, Takeshi's tone softened. He said he knew that many good people had suffered under poor leadership. He said that he took responsibility for not seeing the problems sooner. He said that the company's values of respect, integrity, and innovation were not just words on a wall, they were principles that would be enforced from the top. He announced that there would be immediate changes. First, all employee complaints that had been buried would be reviewed by an independent team from Tokyo. Second, there would be a complete review of promotions and compensation, ensure they reflected actual merit and contribution. There would be mandatory leadership training for all managers, focused on respect and ethical conduct. Fourth, and most importantly, there would be a new system for employees to report concerns directly to headquarters without fear of retaliation. Takeshi spoke. Yuki felt tears streaming down her face. These were not tears of sadness, but of relief. For so long, she had felt powerless and invisible now. Someone in authority was finally acknowledging what had been happening. Someone was finally saying that it was not okay. Takeshi then did something unexpected. He asked Yuki Santos to step forward. Yuki froze. People around her turned to look, and someone gently encouraged her with shaking legs. She made her way to the front of the crowd. Takeshi smiled at her warmly. He said that during his time as a janitor he had observed many employees, but one person stood out for her exceptional talent, dedication, and integrity. Said that Yuki had developed 3 major innovations that had been implemented company-wide, yet she had never received credit or compensation. It was about to change. Takeshi announced that Yuki was being promoted immediately to senior data analyst with a significant salary increase. Furthermore, she would be given full credit for all her previous work, and she would be appointed to a new task force responsible for rebuilding the office culture. The crowd erupted in applause. The coworkers who had watched her struggle for so long cheered loud. Yuki stood there overwhelmed. Unable to speak, Toshi extended his hand, and this time it was accepted. As they shook hands, he spoke quietly in Japanese, so only she could hear. He thanked her for her kindness to a janitor she thought could barely speak English. He said her compassion had shown him that, despite everything good, people still existed in his company. Yuki responded in her limited Japanese, thanking him then. In English, she said she could not believe Ken had been him all along. Takeshi smiled and said that sometimes leaders need to remove their titles to see the truth. After the announcement ended, employees slowly dispersed back to their work areas. But the energy in the building had completely changed. People were talking excitedly about what had just happened. There was a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. Takeshi spent the rest of the day in meetings with various departments here. Listened to employees share their experiences and concerns. He took notes and asked questions. He made it clear that he was not just visiting, he would be staying in Los Angeles for the next several weeks to personally oversee the transition. That afternoon, Takeshi found Carlos, the janitorial supervisor. Carlos looked nervous, thinking perhaps he was in trouble for his role in the deception, but Takeshi shook his hand warmly and thanked him. He said that Carlos had shown him what real leadership looked like. The way Carlos treated his team with dignity and respect was a model for how all managers should behave. Carlos was moved almost to tears. He said he had just been doing his job. Takeshi said that was exactly the point. Everyone, from the janitor to the CEO, should take pride in doing their job well and should be treated with equal respect. As the day came to a close, Yuki knocked on the door of the temporary office Takeshi was using. He invited her in, and she sat down, still looking somewhat dazed. Said she did not know what to. Said Takeshi told her that no words were necessary, her work had spoken for itself. Yuki asked why he had chosen to go undercover as a janitor. Takeshi thought for a moment before answering. He said that his father had taught him that the view from the top shows you nothing about what happens on the ground. He said that reports and presentations could hide the truth, but the way people treat those they consider beneath them reveals their true character. He said that by becoming invisible, he had finally been able to see. Clearly, Yuki nodded, understanding. Then she asked what would happen next. Takeshi said that the company would be rebuilt from the ground up. It would take time and effort. There would be mistakes along the way, but they would do it together with transparency and integrity. Yuki left his office. Takeshi sat back and reflected on. The Datha revelation had gone exactly as planned. Justice had been served, but he knew this was just the beginning. Real work of rebuilding trust and creating a healthy culture would take months or even years, but for the first time in a long time. Takeshi felt genuinely hopeful. He had seen the worst of what his company had become, but he had also seen the best in people like Yurki and Carlos and Robert. Those were the people he would build the future on. And this time he would make sure that future was worth building. The days following the dramatic revelation were intense and transformative. Takeshi had decided to stay in Los Angeles for 6 weeks rather than returning immediately to Tokyo. He wanted to be present for the rebuilding process and to show employees that the changes were real and lasting. The first order of business was addressing the leadership vacuum. With Richard Crawford and his senior managers gone, the office needed new direction. Kashi brought in interim managers from other branches, people he knew and trusted, who embodied the company's true values, but he also made it clear that these positions would eventually be filled by promoting from within based on merit. On Friday, just 1 day after the big announcement, Takeshi held the first of what would become weekly town hall meetings. Every employee was invited to attend and encouraged to speak freely. The conference room was packed with people sitting in chairs, standing along the walls, and some even sitting on the floor. Takeshi stood at the front without a podium or formal presentation. He simply opened the floor for questions and comments. At first there was hesitant silence. People were not used to this kind of openness then. A woman named Lisa Chen raised her hand. She worked in customer service and had been with the company for 5 years. She asked if the new policies would really be different, or if things would eventually go back to how they were. It was a fair question, and Takeshi appreciated her honesty. He said he could not blame anyone for being skeptical given what they had experienced, but he made a commitment. He said that he would personally review employee feedback every month. He said that anyone who witnessed retaliation for speaking up should contact him directly. He gave out his email address and said it would be monitored by him personally, not delegated to an assistant. More hands went up. Robert Park, the young analyst who had been publicly humiliated, asked about the process for reporting manager misconduct. Takeshi explained the new system that had been implemented. There would be multiple channels, including anonymous reporting and a direct line to Tokyo. All complaints would be investigated by an independent team. Another employee asked about the promotion process under Richard's leadership. Promotions had seemed arbitrary and based on favoritism. Takeshi acknowledged this and said that a new transparent system was being developed. Would include clear criteria, peer reviews, and regular feedback. Promotions would be based on contributions, skills, and alignment with company values, not on personal relationships with managers. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. By the end, people were speaking more freely, sharing concerns, but also expressing hope. When it concluded, several employees approached Takeshi personally to thank him. One older man shook his hand and said it was the first time in 3 years he had felt respected at work. That comment stayed with Takeshi long after the meeting ended. Over the weekend, Takeshi reviewed personnel files with Keiko and the interim managers. They were identifying employees who had been overlooked or pushed out unfairly. David Chen, the talented programmer who had quit 6 months earlier, was contacted and offered his job back with a promotion and significant raise. He accepted immediately, saying he had been hoping for this opportunity. Patricia Lin, who had quit just 2 weeks before, was also offered her position back with better terms. She agreed to return, saying she had loved the company's mission and was glad to see leadership finally living up to it. Takeshi also spent time with the janitorial staff. Carlos and his team were invited to a private meeting where Takeshi thanked them personally. He announced that their wages would be increased to match the highest industry standards in the area. He also said that going forward, the cleaning staff would be included in company events and recognition programs. Carlos was visibly moved. He said that in 30 years of doing this work, he had never felt so valued. The following Monday, Takeshi implemented another significant change. Executive Lounge on the 7th floor was converted into a community space for all employees. The expensive furniture was redistributed, and the room was transformed into a comfortable break area with games, books, and relaxation spaces. Meanwhile, the regular employee break room was completely renovated, with new appliances, comfortable seating, and better lighting. Message was clear: there would be no more class divisions in the workplace. Everyone from the newest hire to the CEO deserved quality spaces. Takeshi also made a point of eating lunch in the common areas rather than in private. He sat with different groups of employees each day, listening to their ideas and concerns. At first, people were nervous eating with the CIO, but Takeshi's warm manner and genuine interest put them at ease. Asked about their work, their families, their aspirations, he shared stories about starting the company and the mistakes he had made along the way. These casual conversations revealed insights that no formal meeting ever could. Yuki Santos was settling into her new role on the culture task force. She had been given a team of 5 people from different departments, and they were tasked with developing recommendations for long-term cultural improvements. Takeshi met with Yuki's team regularly to hear their progress. One afternoon, they presented a proposal that impressed him deeply. They suggested implementing a mentorship program where senior employees would be paired with newer hires. They proposed quarterly innovation showcases where anyone could present ideas, regardless of their position. They recommended creating employee resource groups for different communities and interests. Most importantly, they suggested a recognition system where peers could nominate each other for contributions. All the credit would not flow upward to managers. Takeshi approved all the recommendations and asked Yuki's team to begin implementation. Immediately, as weeks passed, the transformation became more visible. Atmosphere in the office shifted from tense and fearful to collaborative and energetic. People started staying late again. But now it was because they were excited about their projects, not because they were afraid to leave. Innovation increased as employees felt safe sharing ideas. Several proposals that had been sitting dormant were suddenly brought forward. One came from Robert Park, who had designed a more efficient client onboarding system. Imbered the old regime. He had been too afraid to suggest it, fearing criticism. Now he presented it confidently, and it was quickly adopted. Another came from a quiet woman in accounting named Helen Juche, had noticed inefficiencies in the expense reporting system and had developed a streamlined solution. Her idea saved the company significant time and money. Takeshi made sure both Robert and Helen received recognition and bonuses for their contributions. 1 month after the revelation, Takeshi held another town hall meeting. This time, the mood was completely different. People were smiling and engaged. When Takeshi asked for feedback, the responses were overwhelmingly positive. However, there were still concerns. Some employees worried about what would happen when Takeshi returned to Tokyo. Would the new managers maintain the culture, or would old patterns re-emerge? Takeshi addressed this directly. He said he would not be returning to Tokyo full-time. Instead, he would split his time between offices, spending at least 1 week per month in Los Angeles. He also announced that the company was implementing a new leadership development program. High potential employees would be trained not just in technical skills, but in ethical leadership. Goal was to build a pipeline of leaders who embodied the company's values. He pointed to Yuki as an example. She demonstrated not just technical excellence, but also integrity and compassion. Those were the qualities the company would cultivate and promote. 6 weeks after his revelation, Takeshi felt confident that the changes were taking root. The Los Angeles office had gone from the lowest performing branch to one of the most innovative. Employee satisfaction scores had jumped dramatically. Turnover had stopped completely, and several talented people who had left were returning on his last day before returning to Tokyo. Takeshi spent the morning walking through the office. He stopped to chat with people at their desks. He thanked them for their patience during the transition and for their commitment to building something better. In the afternoon, there was a gathering in the main common area. Employees had organized it as a surprise to thank Takeshi. There were speeches and presentations. Carlos spoke on behalf of the facility's staff, expressing gratitude for the respect and recognition they had received. Robert Park spoke about how the new culture had given him confidence to share his ideas. Helen Zhao talked about finally feeling valued for her contributions, and Yuki gave a speech that brought many people to tears. She talked about her journey from feeling invisible and defeated to being empowered and recognized. She said that Takeshi had not just changed policies, he restored dignity to people who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with respect. She said that the 2 weeks he spent as a janitor had taught Everyone a powerful lesson that true leadership requires humility and the courage to see things as they really are. When it was Takeshi's turn to speak, he kept it brief. He said he was proud of what they had accomplished together. He said the credit belonged to them, not to him. They were the ones doing the hard work of innovation and service. He had simply removed the obstacles that were preventing them from doing their best. He also shared something personal. He said that his time as Ken, the janitor, had been one of the most important experiences of his career. It reminded him why he started the company in the first place, not to build an empire or accumulate wealth, but to create something meaningful where talented people could do their best work in an environment of respect and integrity. He said he had learned that you can tell everything about a company by watching how people treat those they think do not matter in a healthy organization. Everyone matters. Before he left, Yuki approached him with a gift. It was a photograph in a simple frame. The photo showed Takeshi in his janitor uniform standing with Carlos and the cleaning crew. Everyone was smiling. Yuki said she wanted him to keep it as a reminder that the view from the ground floor is where the truth lives. Takeshi accepted the gift with deep gratitude. He said he would keep it on his desk in Tokyo, where he would see it every 6 months. Later, the Los Angeles office had become the crown jewel of the company. It led all other branches in innovation, employee satisfaction, and performance. The story of Ken, the janitor, had spread throughout the organization. It became a legend that new employees learned during orientation, but more importantly, it became a standard. Managers knew they were being watched not by surveillance, but by the people they led. They knew that how they treated the most junior employee mattered just as much as how they treated executives. The culture of fear had been replaced by a culture of trust. Uki Santos had been promoted again to Director of Innovation. She led a team of 30 people and was considered one of the rising stars of the company. When asked about her success, she always mentioned Ken. She said that a janitor had shown her more about leadership than any business book, that kindness and integrity were not weaknesses, but strengths, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is listen. Takeshi kept his promise to visit Los Angeles monthly. Each time he made a point of spending time with employees at all levels. He ate lunch with the facility's staff. He attended team meetings for junior analysts. He never forgot the lessons he had learned during those 2 transformative weeks, and on his desk in Tokyo, the photograph remained in its prominent place. A reminder that true leadership is not about the title you hold, it is about the character you demonstrate, especially when you think nobody is watching. The story of the CEO who stayed silent until the janitor addressed him in Japanese became more than just a corporate turnaround tale. It became a testament to the power of humility, courage, and the belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, and it proved that sometimes the best way to lead is to first learn what it feels like to serve.